Section 1. The whisper that could end your life. It always begins quietly. A whisper, a glance, a question left hanging too long in the smoky air of the village tavern. In the world of medieval Europe, where faith rules hearts and power rules faith, even the smallest ripple of doubt can bring the tide crashing down on your life. You don't need to curse God. You don't need to burn a church. You don't even need to say anything at all. Sometimes it is enough to read the wrong book, speak Latin too well, or question why your priest eats meat during Lent while your children starve. And in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, questioning was dangerous. Because now, heresy was not just a sin, it was treason against the divine order. And in a society where church and crown held hands, treason against one was an attack on both. You are a peasant, perhaps, or a merchant, or maybe you're better educated than most, a scribe, a tutor, someone who has seen books others have not. You think sometimes that things could be different, that maybe not all God's truth must come through bishops wrapped in gold robes. Maybe the scriptures could be read by everyone. Maybe the church's wealth could be better spent on feeding the poor. But you don't say that out loud. Still, someone suspects. A neighbor overhears your quiet discussion with a traveler. A jealous rival spreads rumors. Or perhaps the parish priest, stern and red-faced with wine, notices your absence at Mass. There is no need for evidence, just suspicion, just enough for a letter to be written, sealed with wax, and sent to a bishop or an inquisitor passing through the region. And so it begins. One day, you're summoned, not by the king's men, but by the church. A cleric delivers the notice. He does not accuse you. He does not shout. He smiles politely and says, "The Holy Office requests your presence for a brief inquiry." You are not told what it's about. You are not given a date for trial. You are expected to come, immediately. You arrive at a stone building. It is not a courthouse, but it is more terrifying. It is quiet, too quiet. A heavy wooden door creaks open. Inside, the air is still, smelling faintly of old parchment, candle smoke, and something metallic, perhaps dried blood. The room is dimly lit. No windows. The floor is bare stone. A table sits in the center. Behind it, a man in dark robes with a cross around his neck. His face is unreadable. He is an inquisitor. He tells you that you are being questioned, not charged, yet. But already, the wheels have turned. You are not on trial, but you are not free. Anything you say can and will be recorded by the scribe sitting nearby. Every pause, every tremble, every contradiction noted in ink. You are asked about your beliefs, your reading habits, your associations. Have you read the scriptures in your native tongue? Have you met with foreigners? Do you attend Mass regularly? Do you believe in the authority of the Pope? The questions come gently at first, then sharper, more invasive. Do you believe the Eucharist is truly the body of Christ? Do you believe all men must confess through a priest to receive forgiveness? Have you ever denied the authority of Holy Mother Church? If you hesitate, even for a heartbeat, it is noted. If your answers are unclear, inconsistent, or too thoughtful, it is noted. You feel the ground shift beneath your feet. You realize too late that this is not a conversation. It is a net carefully woven, and you are already caught. In many inquisitorial systems, particularly in places like Spain or southern France, a secret phase begins. Your neighbors are questioned, without your knowledge. Accusers remain anonymous. Evidence is collected, but you are not told what it is. You are not given a defense. There is no lawyer. The church believes it is acting for the good of your soul, and to save it, it must expose the infection within. If the accusations persist, you are formally charged. You may be imprisoned, not in a dungeon, but a cold, damp cell in a monastery or inquisitorial house. There is little light. Rats may be your only visitors. Food is simple, often spoiled. You are allowed no contact with your family. Time becomes a blur. Days bleed into nights. You pray, not because you are guilty, but because you hope someone somewhere still believes you are innocent. Eventually, you are brought again to the chamber. This time, it is no longer a mere inquiry. It is a judgment. You are told the charges, though not the full evidence. If you deny them, the inquisitor may offer you persuasion. Sometimes this means more questioning. Sometimes it means isolation, hunger, or sleep deprivation. But in some parts of Europe, especially during the later Inquisitions, it meant torture. The church officially forbade drawing blood or causing death. But the creativity of pain knew no bounds. The strappado, where your arms are tied behind your back and you are suspended in the air by a rope, was common. The rack stretched your limbs. The heretic's fork kept your head still, preventing you from resting. Inquisitors told themselves this suffering was necessary. If your soul was at risk, your body must be disciplined into confession. And many did confess, not because they believed themselves guilty, but because the pain was unbearable, because they wanted it to end, because they were promised mercy if they admitted fault. But mercy had many forms. If you confessed, you might be forgiven, but only after public penance. You could be paraded through the town in a hair shirt, barefoot, holding a candle as the priest announced your sins. You might be branded, imprisoned for years, or forced to wear a yellow cross on your clothing, marking you forever as a heretic. If you refused to confess, or if your crime was deemed too dangerous, if, for instance, you had influenced others, or held books now banned by the church, you could be excommunicated, imprisoned indefinitely, or worse. You could be handed over to secular authorities for punishment. The church would not kill you, but the state, acting as the executor of divine justice, would. And that meant only one thing: fire. Burning at the stake was not merely punishment, it was spectacle. It was designed to terrify others into submission. Crowds would gather, prayers would be sung, a sermon delivered, warning the faithful of the dangers of heresy. You, bound and surrounded by kindling, were the example, not just of sin, but of defiance. The flames were not fast, they were not merciful. Sometimes, if the authorities were kind, they placed bags of gunpowder near the neck or strangled the victim beforehand. But often you would be left to burn, screaming, as smoke and ash choked the air. And when it was over, if your bones survived, they would not be buried in hallowed ground. You would be forgotten, erased, all because someone whispered. Section 2, written in the bedtime history style and approximately 1,200 words long. Section 2, the machinery of the Inquisition, from suspicion to system. The most terrifying thing about the medieval treatment of heresy wasn't just the violence, it was the system, cold, calculated, and institutionalized. You might imagine angry mobs with pitchforks and torches, and yes, those existed. But far more chilling was the quiet efficiency of the Inquisition, not a temporary panic, not chaos, but order, bureaucracy, a sacred machine built to identify, crush, and erase dissent, one name at a time. It all started with the church's realization that heresy wasn't going away. In fact, it was spreading. In the 12th and 13th centuries, movements like the Cathars in southern France and the Waldensians in the Alps began questioning the wealth and authority of the church. They weren't chaotic rebels. Many lived simple, peaceful lives. They preached poverty, read scripture, and rejected what they saw as a corrupt, gold-drenched clergy. And to the Catholic Church, that was far more dangerous than any barbarian sword. So the church responded not with sermons, but with structure. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX created the first official papal inquisition. Unlike earlier efforts to squash heresy through violence or crusade, this was different. This was a permanent office, staffed by educated, relentless men. Many were Dominicans, an order devoted to preaching and learning, chosen for their intellect and loyalty. They were given sweeping authority to investigate, detain, and try anyone suspected of heresy. They had rules, procedures, documentation. It began with an edict of faith, an official church declaration posted in a town or read aloud by priests. It demanded that all faithful Christians must come forward and confess any heretical acts, whether their own or someone else's. This grace period often lasted a few weeks. If you confessed early, punishment might be lighter. But if someone else accused you and you hadn't confessed, your fate darkened. The town itself became a network of informants. Fear spread like a fever. Neighbors watched neighbors. Families whispered at night. Children were instructed to report unusual behavior. The inquisitors didn't need to chase heretics. They simply let fear do the work for them. Within days, dozens of names might arrive, written anonymously, handed over quietly, or whispered in confessional booths. You might be one of those names. You don't know who accused you. You don't know when. But one morning, a knock at your door comes, and you're told you must accompany a cleric to answer some questions. The word heresy is never even used at first. You're brought not to a public courtroom but to an inquisitorial center. These were often attached to monasteries or castles. They had rooms for questioning, cells for holding the accused, and scribes to record every word spoken. You were not allowed a lawyer. In fact, no one was. The inquisitor was judge, prosecutor, and spiritual authority all in one. And the trial? It wasn't like today's trials with juries and evidence. The church believed that heresy was a disease of the soul, and the inquisitor was a kind of physician, one who would cut away lies to save you. Whether you wanted saving or not, you were first asked to swear an oath, to tell the truth, to obey the church. Then came the questions, dozens, hundreds, some about your beliefs, others about your habits. Did you meet privately with groups who read the Bible in your own language? Did you avoid sacraments? Did you refuse to tithe? Every answer was inked into the official Liber Sententiarum, or Book of Sentences. If your answers didn't satisfy the inquisitor, or worse, if they contradicted other testimonies, you might be moved to the next phase, coercion. The church insisted that confession be voluntary, but they had an elastic definition of what voluntary meant. You might be kept in total darkness, or forced to stand without rest, or starved, denied sleep, and isolated for weeks. And if that failed, physical pain might be introduced. The strappado, the rack, the thumbscrew, all were used as a last resort, but used nonetheless. The inquisitor might even remind you that torture was for your own good. After all, wouldn't you rather suffer for a few days here than burn for eternity? Some confessed, some didn't, some told the truth, some lied, just to escape the torment. But either way, once you were judged guilty, and most were, the sentence came quickly. Penance was the most merciful. If you were found to be a relapsed heretic or to have repented sincerely, you might be ordered to fast, go on pilgrimage, or wear humiliating symbols for life, such as a yellow cross sewn to your clothing. You would be watched forever. Imprisonment was more severe, not just weeks, but years, sometimes for life. Not in cozy cells, but in bare stone dungeons with rats, damp floors, and disease. Few survived long. And then there was relaxation to the secular arm, a polite church phrase that meant execution. The church itself claimed it didn't kill. It simply handed over the unrepentant to the state, which enforced the sentence. But everyone knew what that meant. The stake. It was public, deliberate, a warning. But even death didn't always end the punishment. If someone was executed for heresy, their family could lose everything. Property was seized by the church or the local lord. Children were disinherited. Spouses were cast out. In some cases, even the bodies of the dead were exhumed and burned, centuries after their deaths, just to make a theological point. The system was also meticulous. Every trial, every testimony, every sentence was archived. Today, historians have studied thousands of these inquisitorial records. They show patterns, repeated targets, recycled accusations, and confessions made under pressure. Some accused had barely reached adulthood. Others were elderly. Many were women. And many had done little more than question authority or fail to follow religious rituals precisely. It wasn't just about faith, it was about control. The Inquisition became a symbol of the church's determination to enforce obedience, not just in belief, but in behavior. And while some inquisitors were sincere in their desire to save souls, others used their power for politics, revenge, or fear. By the 15th century, the Inquisition's power expanded further. In Spain, the notorious Spanish Inquisition began in 1478, this time under royal control. It targeted not just Christians accused of heresy, but converted Jews and Muslims suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. The cruelty, secrecy, and showmanship reached new heights, and for centuries it spread terror throughout Iberia. But this was only the beginning. The machinery of suspicion, documentation, coercion, and fear would continue grinding across Europe for hundreds of years. And you? If your name was written on that list, even once, you were already halfway to the fire. Section 3. The Inquisition arrives. Fear, faith, and ferocity. You've been accused of heresy. Rumors swirl, neighbors avoid your glance, and suddenly your peaceful routine is shattered. But the worst is yet to come, because soon the Inquisition arrives. Now, let's be clear, there wasn't one single Inquisition. Depending on the time and place, there were different forms, most famously the medieval Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, and later the Roman Inquisition. For now, we'll focus on the early medieval period, when heresy was just beginning to be seen not as a personal belief, but as a threat to the entire social and divine order. You hear the news like a distant thunderclap. A papal inquisitor is coming to town. He may be a Dominican friar, clad in a plain black and white habit, carrying nothing more than a crucifix, some scrolls, and the terrifying weight of church authority. He's not alone. He's backed by local lords, soldiers, even bishops. He has power to question, to investigate, and eventually to condemn. The mood shifts across the village. Everyone becomes suspicious of everyone else. Whispered conversations, sidelong glances, sudden trips into town to confess sins you might not have even committed. You see people who once smiled at you, now cross themselves when you pass. Because now, being associated with you could mean guilt by proximity. The inquisitor doesn't begin with arrests. No, he starts with a sermon. He gathers the villagers together, at the church perhaps, or in the town square, and reads a long, terrifying announcement called the Edict of Grace. It is not as gracious as it sounds. It gives everyone a limited period, maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks, to voluntarily confess any heretical beliefs or practices. If you come forward on your own, you might face penance, public humiliation, maybe a fine. But if you are discovered after the grace period, that's when the real nightmare begins. And the worst part, you don't even know what heresy means anymore. Is it refusing to attend Mass, owning a Bible in the vernacular, reading too many suspicious texts from those traveling scholars, criticizing the wealth of the church, even being kind to someone already suspected? All of these could be seen as signs of heretical sympathy. Heresy is like smoke, hard to grasp, easy to blame. Then comes the questioning phase. You're summoned officially now. It's not a trial yet, just an interview. But it feels like standing before a storm. You're brought to a cold room, sometimes a monastery chamber, other times the cellar of a fortified building. Stone walls, a crucifix looms above. The inquisitor sits behind a table, flanked by clerics who record every word. There may be soldiers nearby in case you resist. But resistance is rare. The sheer terror of the moment makes most people compliant. You are asked to swear an oath, to tell the truth in God's name. And then the questions begin. They ask about your life, your faith, who you talk to, what you read, whether you've had strange dreams, whether you've seen spirits, whether you think the Pope is fallible, whether you've taken communion regularly, whether you've criticized the church. At first they seem friendly, gentle even. But that's the trap. Because if your answers don't match what someone else has said, or if you hesitate, or worse, if you try to hide something, they will know. They've done this before. They can ask the same question a dozen ways. They know how to confuse you, to wear you down. You're not allowed to have a lawyer. You don't even get to see the names of those who accused you. It's their word against your silence. If they find inconsistencies, they bring in witnesses. These could be your neighbors, your former friends, your family. They testify behind closed doors, and you are not allowed to cross-examine them. You don't even know what they said. All you know is that every day you're summoned again, asked more questions, deeper, and then comes the moment you feared, formal accusation. Now you are no longer just a suspect. You are a defendant, and the procedures become darker. Depending on the place and time, the use of torture may now be authorized. Yes, torture. Authorized by men of God, because your soul must be saved, even if your body suffers. The instruments vary. The strappato, where your arms are tied behind your back and you're hoisted into the air and drop suddenly, dislocating your shoulders. The rack, stretching your limbs beyond endurance. The thumbscrew, the iron boot, mock drowning, psychological torment, days without sleep, weeks in a pitch-black cell. All this, and always the same demand, confess. Some confess to stop the pain. Others try to hold out, only to break later. But even if you confess, your fate is not sealed in mercy. Because now the church must determine whether your heresy was relapsed, obstinate, or repented. If it's your first offense, and you appear truly sorry, you might be spared execution. Instead, you might be given penance, public flogging, a pilgrimage to Rome barefoot, wearing a sackcloth robe, maybe permanent branding. You become a living warning to others. But if it's not your first offense, or if the inquisitors believe your repentance is insincere, then you are labeled obstinate. And that's when the church hands you over to secular authorities. You see, the church claims it never sheds blood. That's why executions for heresy are done by local governments. But don't be fooled. It's a theater. Once the church labels you a heretic and hands you over, the authorities almost always execute you. And execution isn't quick. You're tied to a stake, wood piled high around your feet. A hood may be placed over your head. Prayers are read. The crowd gathers. You can feel the heat before the flame even touches your flesh. It's not always fire. In some cases, heretics are hanged, beheaded, or buried alive. But burning is most symbolic. Cleansing by fire, purging the soul, a final spectacle of religious justice. And the message is clear to all who watch. Believe what the church says or else. But here's the most chilling part. This wasn't a rare or isolated event. Thousands were accused over the centuries. In some towns, entire families disappeared. In others, the fear of accusation silenced voices, broke communities, and poisoned faith. The Inquisition did not simply punish heresy. It created an atmosphere where thought itself became dangerous, where questions became risks, where the soul's salvation was entangled with obedience, not understanding. You didn't have to be a witch or a radical preacher. You only had to be different, curious, honest, or simply unlucky. And that is why being accused of heresy wasn't just a legal matter, it was a death sentence wrapped in holy cloth. Section 4. Aftermath and Legacy. The Inquisition never really left. Let's say you survive. Somehow, through confession, coercion, or sheer providence, you're not burned, you're not hanged, you're not buried in a shallow grave, while the townsfolk whisper prayers over your soul. You walk away, but you're not free. Not really. Because surviving the Inquisition doesn't mean the nightmare is over. In fact, it may have just begun. Your body may be intact, but your reputation is in ashes. Everyone knows, or at least they think they do. Maybe they weren't allowed into the courtroom, maybe they didn't hear your confession firsthand, but rumors move faster than facts in medieval villages. You're now the one who was accused. That label sticks. People pull their children away from you. Neighbors won't sell to you. You might be excommunicated or shunned. Your name, once ordinary, is now cursed with suspicion. And if you had a trade, say a blacksmith or a tailor or a midwife, good luck finding clients again. The church might have forgiven you, but the village doesn't forget. Even those who never truly believed in your guilt will treat you like a bad omen, as if simply being near you might invite divine punishment. If you confessed publicly, if you were paraded in sackcloth through the streets or flogged before the congregation, that memory lingers in everyone's mind. You are no longer just you. You are a living warning, a walking reminder of fear, of pain, of obedience. And if you didn't confess, if you somehow avoided torture or conviction, but were investigated, interrogated, or merely named, it might not matter. Guilt by association is a powerful thing. Friends you once trusted will now avoid your home. Family members might beg you to move. Others might quietly burn any letters you ever sent them. In this society, spiritual stain spreads like disease, and fear makes people cruel. But let's take a step back. Why did this happen in the first place? Why was the church so determined to root out heresy with such violence and paranoia? To understand that, we need to understand the medieval worldview. In medieval Europe, heresy wasn't just a religious disagreement. It was cosmic treason. People believed deeply that salvation came only through the church, that heaven and hell weren't metaphors, but real destinations, hanging in the balance every day. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was the gatekeeper to eternity. So if someone started preaching different ideas, say that priests weren't necessary for salvation, or that one could pray directly to God without confession, that wasn't just controversial. It was dangerous. If others believed it, they might fall into error. They might die unsaved. And worse, heresy could spread, like a virus, corrupting towns, undermining authority, triggering rebellion, inviting divine wrath upon entire regions. To the church, rooting out heresy was like fighting a spiritual plague, and they had reason to be afraid. During the 12th and 13th centuries, heretical movements were gaining ground. Groups like the Cathars in southern France rejected the authority of the Catholic Church entirely, believing in a dualistic universe where the material world was evil and the spiritual world pure. They denounced the sacraments, the clergy, and even the crucifix. And they were growing. Then came the Waldensians, who preached apostolic poverty and personal interpretation of Scripture, and later the Lollards, Hussites, and others. These weren't just fringe thinkers. They were entire movements with followers, leaders, books, and even underground churches. To the church, this wasn't just a challenge. It was war. And so, inquisitions became the weapon of choice. Not only did they punish those who strayed, but they terrified others into staying obedient. The fear of being accused, of having your house raided, your body tortured, your name condemned, was often enough to silence dissent before it even began. But the methods used left deep scars. For example, in the Albigensian Crusade, launched against the Cathars, entire towns were massacred. At Béziers in 1209, when asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics, a papal legate reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 people were slaughtered. That wasn't justice. That was annihilation. Even after the initial flames of the medieval Inquisition died down, others took its place. The Spanish Inquisition, launched in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, would become infamous for its brutality, targeting converted Jews, conversos, Muslims, and Protestants. Torture chambers, secret trials, and public executions became part of the social fabric. And unlike earlier Inquisitions, which focused primarily on correcting doctrine, the Spanish version also enforced purity of blood, a racialized approach to faith that would echo through centuries. In some cases, Inquisitions were used not just for faith, but for power. Land disputes, personal grudges, political rivalries, all were sometimes masked as religious accusations. If someone wanted your property, your inheritance, your influence, they could whisper the word heretic and watch the machinery turn. Because in a world where the church and the state were entangled, the lines between sin and crime blurred dangerously. And what of women? Women were especially vulnerable. Though early Inquisitions didn't focus heavily on witchcraft, later periods, especially during the 15th and 16th centuries, would see an explosion in accusations of sorcery, often aimed at women who were midwives, healers, widows, or simply strange. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, argued that women were more likely to be witches due to their supposedly weaker minds and greater sexuality. By the time the witch hunts truly began in earnest, the heresy framework had already been established. Now the same fear, secrecy, and cruelty would be turned toward women, tearing through communities across Europe and the New World. So what happened if you were accused of heresy? You lost your home, your name, your livelihood, often your life. And even if you survived, you were changed forever. But perhaps most chillingly, the institutions that hunted you didn't vanish. They evolved. The Roman Inquisition was founded in 1542 and would continue into the 19th century. The Index of Forbidden Books was maintained until 1966. And even today, in some parts of the world, accusations of heresy, though more symbolic, still lead to imprisonment, violence, or death. The shadows of the Inquisition haven't entirely disappeared. They linger in how we treat dissent, how we fear questions, how we wield power in the name of truth. And so the lesson echoes through time. When belief becomes law and faith becomes a weapon, justice burns. Section 5, the tribunal, where justice met fear. Imagine being summoned. A messenger arrives. Not a knight, not a town crier, but someone plain, robed, expressionless. They hand you a scroll sealed with wax, marked with the cross of the Holy Office. You're not told why. You're simply told to appear at the tribunal. No further explanation. You know what that means. Everyone does. You've been accused of heresy. From the moment that seal breaks, your life is no longer yours. The tribunal, technically called the Ecclesiastical Court of the Holy Inquisition, was unlike anything in the secular world. Its purpose wasn't merely to judge, but to correct. And correction in this case came through confession, penance, and if necessary, punishment. The idea wasn't to destroy heretics, at least not in theory. It was to save their souls, even if their bodies had to suffer for it. When you arrive, you're taken not to a public court, but to a dark, vaulted hall within a monastery or fortress. There is no jury, no advocate to speak for you. The judges are Dominican friars or church officials, educated men, trained in law and theology, fluent in scripture, and deeply convinced of their divine mission. Their robes are black, their expressions neutral. They welcome you politely and begin. First, they ask you to swear an oath, swear to tell the truth, swear to speak freely, swear to obey the church. You do it. You have no choice. Then come the questions. At first, they're general. Do you believe in God? Do you confess your sins? Do you acknowledge the authority of the Pope? You answer, trembling, yes, yes, of course. Then they get personal. Have you spoken against the church? Have you read forbidden texts? Have you questioned the sacraments? And most terrifying of all, have you heard others do so? Because this isn't just about you. It's about rooting out networks. The inquisitors are fishing, not just for guilt, but for names, associates, contacts, anyone who might also be a threat. And in that moment, you realize, even if you're innocent, even if you've done nothing wrong, saying the wrong name could damn a friend, or not saying one could damn yourself. The line between betrayal and survival blurs. You may ask who accused you. The inquisitor refuses to say. The identity of accusers is protected. You may be told that several trustworthy witnesses have spoken against you, but you'll never know who they are. A neighbor? A cousin? Someone you argued with 10 years ago? And you're not allowed to confront them. That's one of the most insidious aspects of the Inquisition. It reversed every principle of fairness. You're assumed guilty. Evidence is secret. Testimony can be hearsay. And you are required to defend yourself, but without knowing what exactly you're defending against. Some people broke under this pressure alone. They confessed simply to end the fear. But if you refused, if you protested your innocence, you would be detained. And detention under the Inquisition was a world unto itself. The prison wasn't necessarily a dungeon of dripping walls and iron chains, at least not always. It was often a cell within a monastery, small and bare. No window, a straw mat for sleep, bread and water, silence. Days passed without contact, without light, without even a sense of time. You might be told that others had already confessed, that your family was suffering, that resistance was a sign of guilt, that God would judge your soul more kindly if you cooperated now. And if that didn't work, there was the final resort, the question. That was the term used for torture. It wasn't supposed to be punishment. It was officially a way to extract the truth, a divine method, they claimed, of revealing hidden heresy. And so, under strict guidelines, yes, there were rules, the inquisitors applied torment. Sometimes it was the strappado, your hands tied behind your back, hoisted into the air by rope, then suddenly dropped to dislocate your shoulders. Other times, the rack, your limbs stretched until the joints tore. There was water torture, what we might call waterboarding today, where cloth was stuffed into your mouth and water poured in, creating the sensation of drowning. The goal wasn't to kill, just to bring you to the edge. And many people broke. Who wouldn't? They confessed to things they hadn't done, accused others who were innocent, signed documents they couldn't read, just to make the pain stop. And yet, ironically, if you confessed under torture, that wasn't enough. Church law required that you repeat the confession freely afterward, in a state of calm. If you recanted, you'd be tortured again. If you affirmed, you sealed your own fate. Once the tribunal had enough, they reached their verdict. There were different levels of guilt. Penance, for those who confessed and showed remorse. You might be forced to wear a cross-embroidered robe for life, or walk barefoot through town, or attend regular public confessions. Your property might be seized, but you'd live. Imprisonment, for repeat offenders or those seen as a danger. This could be temporary or life. Some prisoners were held for decades, slowly wasting away in isolation. Excommunication, the spiritual death sentence. You were cut off from the church, unable to receive sacraments, often banished from your community. Relaxation to the secular arm, the most damning phrase, because the church could not officially execute you. So instead, they handed you over to the civil authorities with the strong expectation that justice be carried out. And justice, in this case, meant death. You were led in procession, clothed in yellow or black, symbols of your guilt painted across your chest, a tall paper hat marked with devils. Crowds lined the streets. Some watched with pity, others with pious satisfaction. And then at the stake, sometimes strangled first and sometimes burned alive, you became an example, a warning, a soul sacrifice for the greater good. The tribunal would record it all, neatly, Formally, a scroll sealed, a box checked, a judgment made. But the truth? There was little justice in it, only control, only fear. What happened if you were accused of heresy? You entered a machine, a system built not for truth, but for obedience. And once it turned its gaze on you, there was almost no escape. Section 6. Trials of Faith, the psychological cruelty of heresy accusations. By the time you were sitting in the stone cell of an Inquisition prison, with straw on the floor and iron shackles around your wrists, the horror had already begun long before. But what came next was a kind of suffering that left scars not only on your body, but on your soul. Interrogations were rarely dramatic confrontations. They were long, grinding affairs designed to wear down your sense of self. The inquisitors weren't monsters in the typical sense. They didn't shout or beat their fists. In fact, they often spoke gently, even piously. They were men of God, after all, claiming to save your soul from eternal damnation. They would ask, "Are you hiding anything, my child? Or do you truly not recall saying such things in front of your neighbor?" They might say, "There are witnesses who have testified. God already knows the truth. Why continue to lie?" This was the psychological warfare of the Inquisition. You'd be kept in darkness or near silence for days, with little food. Sleep was minimal. You'd be denied basic comforts, perhaps water, perhaps warmth. You wouldn't know if it was day or night. This was intentional, to unravel your memory, your confidence, your will. They'd tell you about others who confessed, about neighbors who said you spoke heresy. They wouldn't name them, but the implication was clear. Everyone already knows you're the only one resisting the truth. Eventually, you would begin to doubt your own memories. Maybe you did say something foolish. Maybe your neighbor misheard. Maybe you were drunk that day or angry. Maybe this is a test from God. And if God wants you to confess, who are you to refuse? That's the trap. The Inquisition didn't just want your silence or your pain. They wanted your belief, or at least your surrender. The records are filled with confessions that read more like sermons, people begging for forgiveness, calling themselves sinners, writing long apologies for even the smallest transgressions. Some of those confessions were genuine. Others were the product of weeks of psychological battering. But both ended with the same line: "I renounce my heresy and return to the true church." For those who held out longer or who resisted entirely, there were harsher outcomes. The inquisitors escalated their methods: public humiliation, torture, or imprisonment without end. But perhaps the most feared verdict was being labeled a relapsed heretic. What did that mean? It meant that either you had once confessed and were suspected of slipping again, or that you were pretending to repent but still harboring forbidden beliefs. And that label, relapsed, was almost always a death sentence. The church did not want martyrs. They wanted conformity. But if you became too troublesome, too persistent in your silence or resistance, you would be handed to the secular authorities. And the secular world didn't waste time. In many parts of Europe, once a heretic was declared obstinate or relapsed, the local lord or magistrate was expected to carry out execution within days. Often it would be announced in the town square. Wood would be gathered, a stake set up, a procession formed. You might be allowed to make a final speech. Some used this moment to reaffirm their faith in Christ or in their beliefs. Others simply screamed. But you would burn. Not quickly. The fires were built to ensure you died slowly. Choking, blistering, gasping. If you were lucky, someone sympathetic might throw a rope around your neck and pull tight before the flames reached your chest. That was considered an act of mercy. And all of this, the entire arc from suspicion to ashes, could happen without any real evidence. No one needed to catch you in the act. No one needed to prove beyond a doubt that you believed heresy. All they needed was testimony, rumor, or the suspicion of others. Your thoughts were crimes. Your questions were risks. Your prayers, if said in the wrong way or without proper wording, could be misinterpreted as rebellion. Let's not forget the role of books. In a time when few people could read, possessing the wrong manuscript, maybe a translation of the Bible into your local language, was a heretical act. The church insisted that only Latin scriptures were acceptable. Reading the Bible in the vulgar tongue was considered dangerous because it allowed ordinary people to interpret holy texts without clerical guidance. and interpretation was the gateway to dissent. Some inquisitors would order books to be burned, homes searched, family members questioned. A hidden scroll, a strange symbol, or even a letter from a distant friend could be used to accuse you. And once accused, your entire family might suffer. Children could be left homeless, spouses ostracized, parents disgraced. Heresy had a way of spreading guilt to those you loved most. This was part of the control. You weren't just protecting yourself, you were protecting your family by staying silent, by confessing quickly, by never resisting. But of course, many did resist. Brave men and women, Cathars, Waldensians, later Hussites and Lollards, refused to bow. They believed deeply in their own form of Christianity, their own version of truth, and they paid for it. Entire villages were wiped out, regions depopulated, fields burned, churches desecrated by war and vengeance. And still, the Inquisition marched on. In truth, most inquisitors believed they were saving souls. They thought of themselves not as executioners, but as surgeons cutting out spiritual infection. They believed pain now was better than eternal damnation. They believed conformity was peace. But for those caught in the system, the Inquisition was not salvation. It was annihilation. It crushed the body, the mind, and the community. It made thought itself a threat. And it left behind centuries of silence, of fear, of forgotten voices. Section 7, Heresy in the State, when politics became faith. By the late Middle Ages, the war on heresy was no longer just about religion. It had become a tool of statecraft, a way for rulers to enforce obedience and eliminate dissent. If you were accused of heresy during this time, it was no longer only the church you had to fear, but kings, queens, dukes, and the machinery of early centralized power. Why? Because heresy wasn't just a spiritual danger anymore. It was a political threat. Take, for example, the Cathars of southern France. Their beliefs, centered on dualism and spiritual purity, were certainly at odds with the Catholic Church. But what really drew the ire of Pope Innocent III and the French crown was that the Cathars had become too popular, too independent, and too numerous in the Languedoc region. They had their own clergy, their own customs, and they questioned the wealth and authority of both church and crown. The solution? War. In 1209, the Albigensian Crusade was launched, not against foreign Muslims, but against fellow Christians. Entire cities were burned to the ground. When the town of Béziers was captured, the papal legate was asked how to distinguish Cathars from faithful Catholics. His response became infamous: "Kill them all. God will know his own." Tens of thousands died. Not just heretics, but innocents, children, clergy, peasants. And when the dust settled, southern France was firmly under the control of the French crown. Heresy had been used as justification for political conquest. The same was true in Spain. The Spanish Inquisition, founded in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, was not created by the Pope, but by the monarchs. It was a state-run institution meant to root out secret Jews and Muslims, conversos, who had publicly converted to Christianity but were suspected of clinging to their old faiths in secret. Now imagine being one of those converts. You'd been baptized, gone to Mass, even taken communion. But your neighbors watched you. Did you light candles on Friday nights? Did you refuse pork? Did you whisper prayers in a strange language? All it took was one whisper of suspicion, one angry neighbor, one unpaid debt, and you could be summoned by the Inquisition. The state would seize your property, investigate your family, and torture your confession from you, all in the name of preserving Christian unity. But in truth, it was often about money and fear. The Spanish crown made enormous sums by confiscating the estates of accused conversos, and the Inquisition created a culture of suspicion that kept power firmly in the hands of the monarchy. Religious purity was no longer just about faith. It was a way to purge undesirables, silence critics, and centralize control. In many kingdoms, this pattern repeated. Heresy became a synonym for rebellion. If a peasant revolt broke out, like the Taborites in Bohemia during the Hussite Wars, they weren't just labeled political enemies. They were branded heretics. Why? Because their calls for reform, lower taxes, communal property, and a vernacular Bible threatened both the church and the nobility. By labeling them heretics, leaders could call on crusaders, justify executions, and rally loyal citizens in the name of God. Even kings themselves weren't safe. When Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire clashed with the Pope during the investiture controversy, he was excommunicated and nearly lost his throne. When King John of England refused papal demands, England was placed under interdict, a spiritual lockdown, denying the entire country access to the sacraments. Faith and rule had merged. If you questioned one, you risked the wrath of both. This alliance between church and state became especially dangerous for intellectuals and scholars. A theologian or professor who questioned doctrine might be seen not just as a thinker, but as a threat to public order. The most famous case? Giordano Bruno, a philosopher who dared to speak of an infinite universe and multiple worlds, ideas well ahead of their time. He wasn't just accused of heresy, he was burned alive in 1600 in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome. The execution was public. It sent a message: knowledge that challenges power is dangerous. Even Galileo Galilei, the famed astronomer, felt the weight of heresy. He was brought before the Roman Inquisition in 1633 for promoting the heliocentric model, that the earth revolved around the sun. Though he wasn't executed, he was forced to recant and lived under house arrest for the rest of his life. And remember, Galileo had the support of powerful friends. You likely would not. By now, heresy was no longer about just denying Christ. It included anything that questioned the worldview of the powerful: scientific discovery, political theory, translations of scripture, even poetry and art. Anything could be labeled subversive if it didn't align with orthodoxy. And the punishment? Still the same. Your books burned, your name erased, your family shamed, your body imprisoned, tortured, or publicly executed. What's more chilling is how often the people complied. Crowds gathered to watch executions. Townspeople denounced their neighbors. Families turned on one another. Heresy trials became spectacles, moral theater that reminded everyone of their place. Some of this was fear, but some was genuine belief. People truly thought they were protecting their souls, their community, their eternal destiny. And so they complied. They whispered, they reported, they watched, and the machinery of accusation rolled on. In the end, heresy was never just about blasphemy. It was about power. Who had it, who defined truth, and what happened when you dared to think differently. Section 8. The long reach of the Inquisition, from Spain to Rome. You might think heresy was a local matter. Maybe it started with a rumor whispered between neighbors, a comment made too loudly in a tavern, a misstep in a church sermon. And often, that's exactly how it began. But what most people in medieval Europe eventually came to realize, often too late, was that the wheels of the Inquisition turned much farther than they could ever imagine. Once you were caught in its gears, it didn't matter where you lived, how innocent you believed yourself to be, or how devout you had tried to remain. Because by the 13th century, heresy was no longer just a sin. It had become a crime against the very foundations of Christian civilization. And with that transformation came a new, terrifying force: the institutional Inquisition. The Inquisition wasn't a single event. It was an evolving system, one that changed and expanded over centuries. The first formal papal inquisition was authorized by Pope Gregory X in 1231 as a response to the growing threat of Catholicism and other so-called dangerous beliefs in southern France and northern Italy. From that point forward, the church sanctioned dedicated inquisitors, often Dominican friars, whose sole purpose was to seek out and eliminate heresy wherever it could be found. These men were not bound by parish walls. They operated under papal authority, answering directly to Rome. That gave them tremendous power, power that often eclipsed local clergy, noble courts, and even regional kings. The inquisitors traveled across Europe, setting up tribunals, summoning the accused, and creating vast networks of informants. No one was immune, not farmers, not merchants, not even fellow clergy. And as the machinery of inquisition spread across the continent, it evolved into something darker. By the 15th century, the Inquisition had established a fearsome presence in Spain. But unlike the earlier papal inquisitions, the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, was controlled not by the church alone, but by the Spanish crown. Here, heresy became political. The Inquisition in Spain wasn't just interested in your theological opinions. It wanted your loyalty, your ethnicity, and even your bloodline. targeting primarily conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, and moriscos, converted Muslims. The Spanish Inquisition quickly became a tool for racial and religious cleansing. It operated under the assumption that even those who had outwardly converted to Catholicism could still be secretly practicing their old faith. A single act, lighting candles on Friday night, refusing pork at a meal, washing before prayer, could lead to a trial. But it wasn't just religious customs. Family heritage became a liability. If your grandparents had been Jewish, if you had married into a family of Moorish descent, or if you bore a name associated with another faith, suspicion followed you like a shadow. And it didn't help that the Inquisition often acted on anonymous tips, hearsay, and centuries-old grievances. You didn't have to do anything wrong. Someone merely had to believe or claim that you had. Let's imagine this. You're a merchant in Seville. You were baptized Catholic, go to Mass weekly, and pay your tithes. But your grandfather was a Jew, and your cousin, whom you haven't seen in years, was recently arrested. One morning, you wake to find soldiers at your door. They take you away without explanation. You're told nothing. No charges, no names. Just this: you've been accused of heresy. The trial begins not in a public court, but in a dark chamber. The inquisitor sits above you. A scribe records every word. You are not allowed to know who accused you. You are not told what they said. You're simply asked, do you confess? Confess to what? You start guessing. Maybe it was the book you read, the sermon you questioned, the look you gave during a procession, the fish you didn't eat on a Friday. And if you refuse to confess, things get worse. While earlier Inquisitions emphasized penance over punishment, the Spanish Inquisition normalized torture. The rack, the strapado, water torture, all of these became standard methods for extracting confession. The logic was brutal. The soul must be saved, even if the body is broken. In the dim halls of inquisitorial dungeons, countless people broke. They confessed to flying with demons, consorting with spirits, attending secret Sabbaths, or harboring heretical scrolls. These confessions were often absurd, impossible, but that didn't matter. Once the confession was obtained, the process moved forward. Punishments varied, but they were always humiliating and often fatal. A repentant heretic might be forced to wear the San Benito, a coarse robe marked with symbols of fire and damnation. You'd be paraded through town, mocked and spat on. Your property would be confiscated. Your children would be ostracized. Your name would enter the record, a permanent stain. If you were deemed unrepentant, or if you relapsed after being forgiven, you faced the auto da fe, the act of faith, a public execution performed with great ceremony. Priests preached. The condemned marched in a solemn procession, and then, before thousands, you'd be tied to a stake and burned alive. The flames were your final confession. The terrifying part? These weren't secret, isolated events. They were theatrical performances of power, staged to reinforce the church's dominance and the crown's divine authority. People brought children to watch. Nobles applauded. Church bells rang. Even Rome itself wasn't untouched. In the Papal States, inquisitors continued to enforce orthodoxy. Giordano Bruno, a philosopher and former Dominican friar, was one of its most famous victims. He challenged church cosmology and refused to recant. In 1600, he was burned in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. His tongue was nailed to prevent him from speaking. Meanwhile, the Roman Inquisition, distinct from the Spanish, targeted scientists, thinkers, and writers. Galileo Galilei was famously tried for advocating heliocentrism, which contradicted biblical interpretations. Though he wasn't executed, he was forced to recant and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. What made all of this more terrifying was that heresy became fluid. As church doctrine evolved, so did the definition of heresy. What was permissible in one century became criminal in the next. Yesterday's saints could become tomorrow's heretics. Even popes fell under suspicion, and there was no escaping it. Even if you fled to another country, the Inquisition might follow. Treaties and agreements allowed inquisitors to travel, extradite, and seize assets abroad. Some fled to the New World, but the Inquisition soon took root there too. The institution outlasted many empires. In Spain, it continued until 1834. That's nearly 350 years of fear, torture, and silence. And even then, the trauma remained. Etched into collective memory, into the architecture of courthouses, into the ghostly records of burned libraries and forgotten graves. So what happened if you were accused of heresy? You didn't just risk your life. You risked your family, your legacy, your soul. You became part of a system designed not just to punish belief, but to control it, reshape it, and crush anything that deviated from the approved script. And once that wheel turned towards you, there was almost nothing you could do to stop it. Section 9. The Inquisitor arrives. Confession at all costs. The wooden doors groan open. The cold of the corridor feels almost like wind, though there is none. The Inquisitor enters. He is not what you expected. No horned devil, no slavering beast. He is composed in dark robes bearing a crucifix of iron and a gaze sharper than any blade. You've heard of these men, whispered about in the markets or among farmers by the well. You thought they were just stories, but this man is real. His name, they tell you, is Brother Thomas. He carries a book in one hand and wears no weapons. He does not need them. He speaks your name, and it echoes in the chamber. You answer. He asks if you know why you are here. You begin to speak, to deny, to defend. He raises a hand. Silence follows like a curtain falling. This is not a trial, he says. Not yet. This is inquiry. Do you understand? You nod weakly. What follows is not shouting or immediate threats. It is worse. It is calm. Chillingly calm. Brother Thomas asks questions as if reading them from a script. Do you own any prohibited texts? Have you spoken against the sacraments? Have you witnessed strange occurrences in the night? Do you consort with those outside the church's grace? Each question is a trap, whether you say yes or no. Denial is seen as resistance. Agreement marks you as guilty. The room begins to feel tighter, the shadows longer. There are no windows. Time drips instead of passing. Brother Thomas is patient, but he is not gentle. When you claim innocence, he counters with witness accounts. People you know, your neighbors, friends, have said things, accused you. You don't know if they're lying, mistaken, or if this is a manipulation, but it doesn't matter. The accusation is enough. You ask to face them. You beg to explain. He tells you confession brings mercy. Lies only bring torment. He doesn't say what kind of torment. Not yet. Later, when the Inquisitor leaves, 2 guards remain. They are not cruel, but they are trained to enforce silence. When you cry out, they do not respond. When you ask questions, they do not speak. Their blank stares serve as warning. Speak less. Think more. The Inquisitor will return, and he does. The next day or the same day, time has no shape here. He returns with his assistant, a younger man who carries a wooden box. Inside, implements, not for torture yet. These are items for gathering evidence. They ask again about books, about dreams, about conversations had in whispers. Do you know the names of others? Have you ever thought differently from church teachings? Even stray thoughts can be made heretical. The line between belief and betrayal is razor thin. You begin to wonder, did I say something wrong once? Did I misunderstand a sermon? The seeds of doubt grow fast in soil made of fear. Then something shifts. Brother Thomas places a parchment on the table. It is a confession, not written by you, but one you are encouraged to sign. It contains general admissions. I was led astray by the devil. I blasphemed in ignorance. I now see the error of my ways. The promise is simple. Sign, and perhaps the Inquisition will be lenient. But you've heard what that means. Leniency may be a public flogging instead of death, a pilgrimage of shame, a life sentence in a monastic cell. If you don't sign, worse. You ask for proof. He shrugs. The soul knows its guilt. You hesitate. And that's when the tone changes. The assistant no longer records your answers. He fetches something instead. Ropes, a rack, and candles. Not for light, but to drip wax. Brother Thomas sighs, genuinely regretful. This is not punishment, he says. It is purification. We must remove the devil's hold on your soul, and suffering is the only language he cannot withstand. You try to run. You can't. The guards are swift. They strap you down, not cruelly, just efficiently. It feels like a ritual. Then comes the questioning. Again. This time with pain. Hot wax on skin. Stretching limbs past their natural limit. Burning coals brought near. The tools are many, but the aim is singular. Confession. Your screams are heard only by stone. No one interrupts. No one comes to help. And somewhere inside you, something begins to fracture. Maybe they're right, you think. Maybe I did deserve this. That's what they want. Eventually, through agony or exhaustion, you say the words, I confess. The room stills. Brother Thomas nods. The devil has loosened his grip. You are untied. You collapse. A scribe records your confession. You're given ink and forced to mark your name. It doesn't matter if it's your handwriting. The document exists. Your guilt is now official. But it isn't over. The next stage is public penance. If you're lucky, you'll be paraded through the streets wearing a yellow robe and a pointed cap. Townsfolk will jeer, children will throw filth, and you will recite your crimes aloud. This is to teach others, they say. To protect the flock by shaming the infected sheep. In some cases, you're sentenced to pilgrimage, sent away barefoot in rags to walk to a holy site hundreds of miles away. You beg along the road, sleep in ditches, and are spat on at every village you pass. In worse cases, they decide your soul is too far gone, that your confession, though complete, cannot undo the damage you've done. And that's when the word auto da fe is whispered, a ritual act of faith in which the heretic is burned. You are not told the verdict immediately. They give you hope, just enough to make you weep with relief when they say life. And then, just before you are led out to the square, they change their minds. Some inquisitors believe that only fire can purify completely. And as the flames crackle and the crowd watches in silence, your story ends not in fire, but in silence. And that silence will be your legacy. Section 10. After the flames, the legacy of fear. The smoke from the execution lingers long after the fire is out. Ashes settle into the cobblestones. The scent of scorched flesh clings to every breath the villagers take. For some, it's a reminder of divine justice. For others, a warning. But for everyone, it's unforgettable. And for those left behind, the family of the accused, the neighbors who watched, the children who asked too many questions, the impact goes far beyond fear. The execution isn't the end of a single life. It's the beginning of a new silence, a wound that festers deep in the heart of a community. You see, in medieval Europe, being accused of heresy didn't just mark you. It marked everyone around you. If your wife or husband was taken by the Inquisition, you became suspect by association. If your father burned, your name could carry shame for generations. Sometimes entire families disappeared, out of fear, out of disgrace, or out of sheer survival instinct. Neighbors turned cold, friends disappeared, and worse, some took advantage. The fields of the executed needed tending. Their homes were sometimes seized, donated to the church, or claimed by local lords under the excuse of spiritual cleansing. The belongings of a heretic were often forfeit, sold to fund further inquisitions, or line the pockets of pious men. Fear fed opportunism. The machinery of suspicion never stopped. Even priests, the very men entrusted with shepherding the souls of their flocks, could find themselves under scrutiny. One careless sermon, one theological error, one misquoted psalm. The line between orthodoxy and heresy was not only razor thin, but shifting. What was safe one year might be outlawed the next. Books were banned, then rewritten. Doctrines evolved under papal decrees. But your memory, your words, those were permanent in the minds of others. If someone had a grudge against you, all it took was a whispered accusation. A rival merchant could hint that your success was unnatural. A jealous suitor might claim a romantic rival practiced dark rites. A widow who spoke too freely could be labeled dangerous. Sometimes you never even heard the accusation. You were simply taken. The worst part? Most people didn't resist. They couldn't afford to. The system was too strong. And after witnessing one or two inquisitions, after seeing what happened to those who questioned too loudly, you kept your head down. You didn't speak of dreams. You didn't ask about strange lights in the sky. You didn't mention that the priest's Latin seemed off. Silence became safety. Ignorance became armor. The Inquisition knew this. It fed on silence. Every trial, every public confession, every execution, it wasn't just about purifying souls. It was about reminding the rest of the population that the church saw everything, that no one was beyond its reach, that heresy wasn't just a personal sin, it was a disease that infected families, towns, and kingdoms, and kings noticed. Monarchs who feared rebellion or dissent were quick to align themselves with the church, using inquisitorial power to purge rivals. Politics and religion became entwined. In Spain, this led to the Spanish Inquisition, a special brand of brutality that weaponized heresy to enforce royal policy. Jews, Muslims, and even converted Christians were targeted, often with absurd justifications: the way they cleaned their homes, the way they prepared food, the holidays they celebrated. These weren't crimes, they were differences. But in the age of heresy, difference was dangerous. It wasn't just belief that could condemn you, it was identity. By the late Middle Ages, heresy hunts had grown into complex bureaucratic institutions. There were records, scribes, taxes for funding investigations. There were traveling inquisitors who kept schedules, sent reports to Rome, and followed manuals for interrogation. Torture wasn't applied randomly, it followed procedures. Confessions were cataloged. Punishments were calibrated to serve both spiritual correction and political order. This wasn't chaos, it was order, meticulously maintained, a terrifying bureaucratic order. And if you were an ordinary person, that made it worse. Because when systems become impersonal, cruelty becomes invisible. A boy accused of heresy for asking why bread turned into Christ's flesh. A woman condemned because her herb garden healed too well. A monk burned because his visions didn't match official doctrine. These stories were not rare. They were the background noise of medieval life. You didn't need to be a rebel to be destroyed. You just needed to be human. Eventually, some began to question this order, quietly at first. Scholars in Paris, monks in German abbeys, nobles in northern Italy, people began writing critiques, smuggling banned texts, and speaking in secret. Heresy didn't vanish. It evolved. It went underground. And sometimes it came back stronger. Movements like the Cathars, the Waldensians, and later the Lollards, all labeled heretical, grew in the shadows of persecution. The more the Inquisition tightened its grip, the more dissent simmered beneath the surface. And when the pressure built too high, revolutions followed. But that was in the future. In the moment, in the quiet after the flames, a village tried to return to normal. Children were hushed, bells tolled. Life went on, but not unchanged. A heresy trial was like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples never truly stopped. And if you were one of the silent ones, if you'd watched your friend be taken, if you'd said nothing when the inquisitor asked if you'd ever heard strange words spoken, you carried that silence like a second skin, because you knew the truth. No one was safe, not the pious, not the poor, not the powerful. All it took was one moment, one whisper, one wrong word. And then the knock on the door would come, just like it did for them. Section 11. The Heretics' Children, Stigma that Lived On. You might think that once the fires were extinguished and the screams faded, life would return to normal, that the village would simply pick up its tools, mend its fences, and move on. But you'd be wrong. For those who remained, the children, the spouses, the siblings of the accused, life after a heresy trial was not life as it was before. It was a strange purgatory suspended between survival and stigma. Even if you had done nothing wrong, even if you had never spoken a word out of place, the fact that someone in your bloodline had been labeled a heretic was enough to brand you for years, sometimes for generations. In some places, it began with the church. Priests would refuse to bless the remaining family. Baptisms might be denied, marriages delayed. The family might be barred from taking communion or participating in local religious festivals. All of it unspoken, of course. No edict declared them cursed. But the villagers knew. The silence was louder than any condemnation. Children of heretics were often shunned by other children. They might be excluded from guild apprenticeships or forced to beg at the edges of the market square while merchants pretended not to see. If they were taken in by relatives, those relatives were watched more closely. If they stayed alone, they became outcasts in their own homes. The stain of heresy was sticky. It didn't wash away with time. It passed from generation to generation like a curse. And that was exactly the point. The Inquisition was not just about correcting error. It was about controlling memory. If the community remembered a heretic only as a cautionary tale, if they remembered the screaming and the burning but forgot the person's face or voice, then the church's hold remained firm. It ensured that no one asked the most dangerous question of all: what if they were right? To guard against that possibility, every effort was made to erase the individual while preserving the terror. In trial records, the names of the condemned were often followed by the same phrases: confessed and recanted, relapsed and unrepentant, burned for the salvation of their soul. But rarely were their words preserved. Rarely were their ideas debated. They were stripped of humanity, reduced to symbols, turned into tools for the church's continued authority. But human memory is stubborn. And even as families of the condemned suffered, some tried to preserve the truth, quietly, in whispers, in letters hidden beneath floorboards, or etched into the backs of pews. Some recited the condemned's final words in secret prayers. Some passed down fragments of belief through lullabies, stories, or coded embroidery. Because even if you couldn't say it aloud, even if you couldn't prove it, you remembered who they were. Not a heretic, not a monster, but your father, your sister, your son. And sometimes those memories sparked resistance. In regions where heresy trials were most brutal, southern France, northern Italy, parts of Spain, underground networks began to form. These weren't always rebellions in the open sense. They were acts of quiet defiance, sharing banned texts, holding secret gatherings in barns or cellars, refusing to denounce others when questioned. The more the Inquisition pushed, the more it created exactly what it feared, a population that no longer trusted the church blindly. People began to notice inconsistencies. Why did some heretics burn while others simply paid a fine? Why were poor villagers more likely to be tried than wealthy nobles? Why did inquisitors seem to grow rich while preaching poverty? In these whispers, something dangerous began to grow. Doubt. And from doubt came solidarity. There are recorded instances of entire communities refusing to testify, villagers hiding accused individuals, priests being ousted by their own congregations for cooperating with inquisitors. Even in places where fear reigned, humanity flickered. But these acts came at a cost. Families that shielded heretics risked annihilation. Villages that resisted could be excommunicated or even razed. There were cases where inquisitors returned with armed escort, knights acting under papal authority, to punish entire regions. Still, the flame of resistance didn't die. Over time, as Europe changed, through war, through plague, through the slow grind of intellectual evolution, the grip of the Inquisition loosened. The Renaissance brought new ideas. The printing press made it harder to suppress information. The Reformation shattered the illusion of a singular Christian truth. And yet, the scars remained. Even centuries later, in towns with crumbling churches and silent bells, stories lingered. Old names were spoken with hesitation. Fields were said to be cursed. Children were warned not to go near certain wells or woods, places where heretics were rumored to have died. Modern historians, digging through ancient parchment and faded ink, have found records of heresy trials that read like horror fiction. Mothers executed in front of their children. Men tortured into madness. Communities divided by fear and suspicion. But they also find traces of resilience, margins in inquisitorial ledgers where someone scribbled doubts, notes in books indicating sympathy for the condemned, parish records that quietly omitted heresy convictions, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of mercy. The children of heretics didn't always become martyrs. Some grew up, changed their names, and lived quiet lives. Others became rebels, preachers, or thinkers. And some carried the burden silently until their final days. But the shadow of heresy never truly left them. In a way, it never left Europe. It lingered in the way people approached authority, with reverence, yes, but also with caution. It lived in the bones of cities that once held public burnings. It crept into stories, into lullabies, into fears passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. And even now, when we hear stories of suppression of show trials, of neighbors turning on neighbors under pressure, we recognize the echoes. Because the legacy of heresy isn't just about faith. It's about what people are willing to do, to others and to themselves, when fear is used as a weapon and silence becomes survival. Section 12. The price of mercy. When forgiveness wasn't free. Suppose, just for a moment, that you were one of the lucky ones. That is, if lucky means you weren't tortured to death, burned at the stake, or buried alive for heresy. You confessed, you repented, you were deemed salvageable. But mercy in the medieval world, especially from the church, didn't come without a price. In fact, it often came with costs that lingered far longer than flames. The inquisitors might have spared your life, but that didn't mean you walked away unscathed. First, there was the matter of public penance, a ritual of humiliation so complete it was designed to break not only your body, but your spirit. You would be brought into the town square, usually barefoot, wearing a rough tunic, or even just your underclothes. Sometimes a rope was slung around your neck, a symbol of your submission. If your punishment was harsher, you might be forced to wear a sanbenito, a yellow robe marked with red crosses, or worse, the image of flames licking upward, a reminder of what could still await you. There, in front of your neighbors, your family, your former friends, the inquisitor would read aloud your sins, often exaggerated, sometimes invented entirely. Then came the acts of penance, kneeling in the dirt for hours, carrying a heavy cross through town, whipping yourself in public processions. Some were ordered to stand outside the church every Sunday for a year, begging for re-entry like a dog waiting at the door. And even if you endured all that, you were not truly free. Because true absolution, the kind that returned you to full standing in your community, was rare. Most likely, your property had already been confiscated. Your name was inscribed in the records, and worse, you had a mark that was invisible but undeniable. You had been judged a heretic. You couldn't join a guild. You couldn't testify in court. Your children were often barred from church schools. If you were a priest or monk, your career was over. If you were a merchant, good luck finding partners or buyers. Every business deal, every social invitation, every marriage proposal that came your way might now fall apart at the whisper of one word, heretic. And the inquisitors knew it. In some cases, they preferred you alive and marked. A living warning was more effective than a dead martyr. You were a ghost among the living, a cautionary tale made flesh. For many, life after forgiveness became a second punishment. Take the case of Beatrice, a widow in Toulouse, accused of sympathizing with the Cathars. She recanted under pressure and was spared execution. But the church stripped her of her dowry, her home was taken by the local bishopric, and her son was denied entry into the city's artisan guilds. She spent the rest of her life in a poorhouse, praying loudly in public to prove her faith, while neighbors crossed themselves as she passed. Or consider Marcello, a stonemason in northern Italy, accused of keeping forbidden texts. He claimed ignorance, blamed a neighbor, and wept for mercy. He was spared, but forced to wear a sanbenito for 5 years. When his wife died during childbirth, the local priest refused to bury her in consecrated ground. He buried her himself, weeping, under the shadow of a ruined wall. Even years after, those who confessed were often required to report regularly to church authorities. They were watched, questioned, their homes searched at random. If they missed a penance or were spotted with suspicious company, their mercy could be revoked. Recidivism, being a relapsed heretic, was a death sentence. But perhaps the most disturbing cost of mercy was internal. You see, many of those who confessed did so under unbearable pressure. They lied. They said what the inquisitors wanted to hear. They named names, friends, relatives, sometimes complete strangers, just to make the pain stop. And they lived with the guilt. Imagine waking every morning knowing someone else burned because of you. Imagine attending Mass, eyes fixed on the altar, while the eyes of a mother whose daughter you accused bore into your back. Imagine passing a neighbor's home, now empty, and knowing you helped make it so. Some tried to make amends in secret, offering money, food, or shelter to families of the condemned. Others became outspoken supporters of the church, hoping to drown their shame in piety. A few fled entirely, joining hermit orders or wandering into distant lands where no one knew their past. And some, in rare cases, broke completely. There are records, buried deep in the annals of inquisitorial archives, of former heretics returning to their errors. Sometimes they stood in the town square and shouted out their old beliefs. Sometimes they walked into church, tore their sanbenito from their shoulders, and set it alight. These acts were not always born of conviction. Often they were cries for release, for death, for closure, for something other than the slow death of being alive and broken. Because the truth was this: forgiveness by the church was never about healing. It was about power. It was about making an example. It was about forcing submission, then parading it for all to see. It was about reinforcing the idea that there was only one path to truth, and that any deviation, no matter how human, how heartfelt, or how harmless, would be crushed. And for those who submitted, who bent but did not break, the path ahead was narrow and steep. But there is something remarkable, too, in their survival, that they lived on. that they endured, that even marked, humiliated, and watched. They breathed, worked, whispered stories to their children. They passed on memories, even if only in shadows. They reminded the world that mercy, as wielded by those in power, is often nothing more than another form of control. And in doing so, they laid a quiet foundation for the centuries to come, for a world in which forgiveness might one day mean something else, something real. Not a mark, not a brand, but a second chance. Section 13, The Silent Watchers, How Fear Policed the Faithful. By now, you might think the worst was over, that if you survived the flames, the torture, the humiliating confession, and even the long years of penance, you could finally fade into anonymity and live out the rest of your life in peace. But that would be a mistake, because the Inquisition didn't stop when the fires burned out. It continued in whispers, in doorways, in glances across market stalls. It endured not just through laws and decrees, but through something even more powerful: fear. In every medieval town and village, fear did what no inquisitor could do alone. It made every citizen into a potential enforcer of orthodoxy. In this world, you were never truly alone. It started with your neighbors. The same people who once smiled and waved as you passed might now lower their voices when you approached. They noticed if you skipped Mass, if you avoided confession, if you muttered something strange in Latin or worse in your native tongue during prayer. And the Inquisition welcomed these silent observers. In fact, it encouraged them. The church established anonymous reporting boxes in some towns, simple wooden chests known as denuncias, where concerned citizens could write down accusations and slip them in, unseen. These boxes were collected and read by local clergy or inquisitors, their contents reviewed with chilling seriousness. Of course, not every accusation was sincere. Sometimes they were fueled by personal grudges. A neighbor jealous of your land, a former friend angry over a business deal gone wrong, a rival suitor. All it took was one note. I have heard Isabel does not recite her evening prayers. Raphael speaks often to Jews. Joan keeps a strange book hidden in her bread bin. And just like that, an investigation could begin. You would be summoned without warning, questioned without clarity, and pressed for information. Who do you speak with? What do you read? Why did you avoid Lent fasting this year? If you were lucky, the matter would be dropped. But even then, your name would go in a ledger, a quiet mark, a reminder that you were now watched. And that fear didn't only silence the accused, it silenced everyone. Because defending a suspected heretic was a risk in itself. If your neighbor was arrested and you protested, you were showing sympathy. If you dared to challenge the inquisitor's decision, you were undermining church authority. If you asked too many questions, you might soon be answering them yourself. The result? A society where no one spoke freely. In the marketplaces of Spain, in the back alleys of France, in the stone-cobbled towns of Italy, people whispered about religion only in hushed tones. Conversations paused when a priest passed by. Parents warned their children not to speak too loudly, lest a careless word draw suspicion. It was particularly dangerous for those with foreign roots, strange accents, or unusual professions. Traveling merchants, midwives, healers, and translators, anyone who straddled two worlds, were seen as inherently suspicious. Many were watched closely, not just by their neighbors, but by traveling inquisitors sent specifically to root out hidden heresy. The fear extended into homes. Many medieval homes were small, one-room structures with no privacy. But for those under suspicion, or those already marked as former heretics, these rooms became cages. Husbands and wives lowered their voices at night. Children were taught to memorize prayers before they could write. Even bedtime stories were scrutinized. A tale with the wrong message could be interpreted as dissent. Over time, this constant vigilance wore people down. Imagine the pressure of living each day like you were on trial. The weight of knowing a single slip of the tongue, a forgotten ritual, or a misunderstood gesture could unravel your entire life. The tension crept into your bones, curled in your stomach, kept you awake at night. And yet some resisted. In secret, in shadows, a quiet defiance grew. Families gathered behind closed doors to read forbidden books, copied laboriously by hand and passed from town to town. Coded language emerged, symbolic gestures, double meanings, rituals passed off as superstition, but rooted in older, outlawed faiths. In some places, communities of so-called heretics went underground, literally, worshiping in caves, in cellars, in the wilderness. They developed warning systems, using carved stones, hidden markings, or songs that only they understood. These were not open revolts, but slow, stubborn survivals of faith. And even among the faithful, seeds of doubt began to grow. People asked themselves, why would a loving God demand torture? Why would truth need to be protected by fear? Why did it seem that the most devout suffered the most? The church, sensing this unease, doubled down. Sermons became more forceful, religious festivals more elaborate. Public burnings were timed for major feast days, ensuring maximum attendance. Children were taught not just to pray, but to report. The fear had to be fed, or it would turn to rebellion. And yet, rebellion did come, slowly, in whispers at first. In the 14th and 15th centuries, reformers began to emerge, priests, scholars, and laypeople who dared to speak aloud what others only dared to think. They questioned the authority of the church, criticized the wealth of the clergy, and condemned the horrors of the Inquisition. Many were killed, but others sparked something larger. Movements like the Lollards in England, the Hussites in Bohemia, and later the Protestant Reformation would shake the very foundations of the church. And while those events were still far in the future, their roots were planted here, in the silence, in the fear, in the quiet eyes of neighbors who had seen too much. For now, though, in the heart of medieval Europe, the Inquisition reigned, and if you had been accused of heresy, even if you had repented, even if you had been forgiven, you would never again be free. You would live your days under watchful eyes, and in that long, lonely silence, you would never forget what fear had taught you. That belief could be commanded, but trust could only be broken. Section 14, The Aftermath, Life Beyond the Inquisition. So, you've survived the grueling process of being accused of heresy, the interrogations, the humiliations, perhaps even the brutal tortures. You might have been spared the flames, but your life as you once knew it is over. Being branded a heretic was a scar not just on your skin, but seared deeply into your very existence. The question now is, what happens after the verdict? What happens to you after the Inquisition has turned its merciless gaze elsewhere? The social consequences were immediate and devastating. Once a valued member of your community, you were now a pariah. Your neighbors, who once greeted you warmly, now crossed the street to avoid you, whispering fearful rumors behind closed doors. People feared the contagion of your supposed evil beliefs. You were no longer invited to communal gatherings or church services, barred from the very places that had once given your life structure and meaning. The church's condemnation was far-reaching. It wasn't just about spiritual condemnation, it meant social exile. Even if the civil authorities didn't imprison you or execute you, your reputation was destroyed. People saw you as a dangerous threat, a vessel of Satan's influence. Families who had been close to yours severed ties abruptly, worried that association with a heretic might jeopardize their own souls or standing. Your economic life suffered equally. Medieval villages were close-knit communities where survival depended heavily on mutual cooperation. Tradespeople, farmers, and merchants relied on each other for goods and services. But once branded a heretic, you faced boycotts. Local merchants refused to sell you supplies or tools, fearing divine punishment or backlash from other villagers. If you were a craftsman, your customers would dwindle. If you were a farmer, neighbors might refuse to buy your produce or help you during harvest. Many accused heretics were left destitute, forced to beg or rely on charity, if any was given. Family life became a battleground of loyalty and survival. Your spouse and children were not immune to suspicion. They might face discrimination, harassment, or worse. Children of accused heretics were often denied access to education or apprenticeships. The stigma could tear families apart. Some relatives chose to distance themselves to save their own reputations, while others stood by you, risking their lives and social standing. Beyond the tangible effects, the psychological and spiritual toll was immense. Survivors carried the scars of their ordeal long after the interrogations ended. Torture and public humiliation left deep emotional wounds. Many wrestled with a crisis of faith. How could the church, the institution they had trusted, turn on them so mercilessly? Others doubled down on their beliefs, seeking comfort in secret prayers and hidden texts, holding fast to the faith that had condemned them. Spiritual exile was one of the cruelest punishments of all. Being cast out from the church was akin to being cast out from the world itself. Without the church's sacraments, you were denied salvation and eternal life in the eyes of society. Many ex-heretics sought refuge in underground networks, small communities that met in secret to worship and preserve forbidden ideas. These clandestine gatherings were dangerous, but vital lifelines for those who dared to question the dominant religious dogma. The legacy of the Inquisition extended beyond individuals to reshape entire societies. It created a culture of fear where suspicion lurked behind every corner. Neighbors watched neighbors. Accusations could be made on flimsy evidence, sometimes fueled by personal grudges, greed, or fear. The threat of heresy accusations suppressed dissent and innovation. It forced people into rigid conformity, stifling intellectual freedom and religious diversity. Yet, paradoxically, this era of persecution also planted the seeds for future transformation. The courage of those who resisted, even in secret, challenged the church's monopoly on religious truth. Their perseverance preserved ideas that would later fuel the Reformation and broader movements toward religious tolerance and individual conscience. For the accused, survival meant more than escaping death. It meant enduring a lifetime of hardship and prejudice. Every day was a balancing act, hiding one's true beliefs while outwardly conforming to orthodox practices. This duplicity was exhausting and dangerous. Discovery could lead to rearrest, torture, or execution. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Even beyond the immediate circle of the accused, heresy accusations affected entire communities. Fear of contamination led to paranoia and witch hunts, where innocent people, especially women, were targeted in waves of violence and persecution. The social fabric of villages and towns was frayed, with neighbors turning on neighbors, families torn apart by suspicion and betrayal. In the end, being accused of heresy was a fate worse than death for many. It condemned you not only to physical suffering, but to a social death, a life lived in shadows, mistrust, and isolation. Yet, through the darkness, a glimmer of resilience shone. The will to survive, to hold on to truth as you saw it, and to pass on forbidden knowledge became acts of defiance that echoed through history. So if you ever imagine what it meant to be accused of heresy in medieval Europe, remember, the flames might have been merciful compared to the slow burn of social exile, economic ruin, and spiritual desolation that awaited those who survived. Section 15, The Long Shadow of Heresy, How the Past Shapes Our Present. The story of heresy accusations and the Inquisition did not end with the fall of medieval Europe. Its echoes resonate far beyond the dark dungeons and burning stakes of the past, shaping modern ideas about faith, justice, and human rights. To fully grasp what it meant to be accused of heresy, we must also understand how this grim chapter influenced the world we live in today. First, consider the legacy of fear and control. The Inquisition exemplified the dangers of unchecked institutional power wielded to enforce conformity and suppress dissent. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when religious or political authorities claim absolute authority over truth and morality. The witch hunts and heresy trials show how fear can be weaponized, leading communities to fracture and individuals to suffer unspeakable injustices. But out of this darkness came important lessons. The abuses of the Inquisition stirred voices of resistance. Over time, philosophical and theological debates questioned the legitimacy of such persecution. These challenges helped lay the groundwork for the Enlightenment ideals of freedom of conscience and expression. The idea that individuals have the right to hold personal beliefs without fear of state or church violence is a hard-won legacy that traces back to those persecuted as heretics. Moreover, the harshness of medieval heresy trials forced the evolution of legal systems and protections. The absence of fair trials, the use of torture, and the reliance on forced confessions eventually spurred reform. Concepts like the presumption of innocence, the right to counsel, and protections against cruel and unusual punishment owe part of their history to a reaction against the excesses of religious tribunals. On a cultural level, the tales of accused heretics have inspired countless works of literature, art, and film, serving as powerful symbols of individual struggle against oppressive systems. From Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice to modern dramas and documentaries, the stories remind us of the human cost of intolerance. Importantly, the memory of heresy accusations challenges us to reflect on modern parallels. Even today, societies grapple with how to balance unity and diversity, authority and freedom. Accusations of heresy have taken new forms, whether in political ideology, social movements, or religious debates, sometimes leading to persecution or social ostracism. The medieval world's brutal approach teaches us the value of compassion, critical thinking, and due process. It warns us of the consequences when fear replaces understanding and dogma replaces dialogue. For those who were accused, their suffering was real and often final. But for history, their stories are a mirror, a reminder of both humanity's capacity for cruelty and its enduring hope for justice. If you were accused of heresy in medieval Europe, you faced a harrowing trial not just of faith, but of identity, community, and survival. And while the fires have long been extinguished, the questions raised by those dark times still burn bright today.